peeps, I have such an awesome interview for you guys today because with me, I have Jeffrey Morris. Now, he is a science fiction writer, director, he's a NASA advisor, and he is the founder of Future Dude, which we're going to be talking all about today because he is working on an awesome new feature as well as a 13-part series called Saturn V. Now, one of the first things that I loved about when I was watching one of your interviews was that you mentioned how back when you were around during the time that there was people on the moon. Right. You were able to look up at night and you're like, there's people up there. And as you know, that's not the case today. We don't have a lunar surface like colony. We don't have any type of anything set up on the moon. So we kind of see that there's been this big gap since then about space travel and the advancement of just scientific research in space other than the International Space Station. So one of the first questions I really want to get out of you is, why do you think scientific advancement is so important?
Well, okay, so it always comes back to, it's interesting because the films, TV shows, the projects that I create, they have a lot of advanced technology. They depict technology and scientific processes, things like that. But at the end of the day, to me, the most important aspect is it's people. It's the human experience. It's helping us define and understand our place in the universe, and really, okay, like I tend to think that human beings are far too, if you look at the mass of humanity, right? It's like we're very on the surface of the earth. We're very two-dimensional. It's not actually that surprising to me that there are movements of people right now who think the earth is flat, simply because there's so few of us that have a broad understanding that we're on a planet, orbiting the sun and in the universe, right? In the galaxy and the universe, so on and so forth. And I think the thing that scientific advancement can do, and finding ways to help everyday people understand the potential that science could give our species, I think that it's incredibly important that we find ways to connect the dots. And I think that using art, literature, film, television, other means to connect those dots will bring more average people into the fold. I'm shocked sometimes at how little average people know about space or know about the oceans or even weather. When you look at some of the climate change issues that are going right now, people's inability to kind of grasp that. It's all interconnected to me. And so I feel like it's like science is doing great. Technology is doing great. It's the ability to connect the dots with the masses that's not going well, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So going back to what you said about the time when we had people up on the moon, that period fired the imagination because there was just so much to, you could literally look up at the moon and know that there were people up there, right? And you could a few days earlier see a massive Saturn V rocket sitting on the pad, with the vapors coming off of it, and and then you'd see it launch and take off, and you'd know that it was going somewhere, right? And then you could look up at the moon and say that's where they went. There's something that happened when we moved from that kind of grand exploration to for people like you and me, robotic exploration is really exciting, right? It's like, wow, they went to Mars and they took these pictures. They went to Jupiter, Cassini, Saturn, things like that. But I think, again, for everyday people, it's hard to make those connections. So yeah. I think there's a challenge ahead of us, and we've got to find new ways and more aggressive ways to bring this down to earth for everyday people. I hope I'm making some sort of sense.
Yes. Yeah. And now that you're saying that too, it makes so much sense to me as to why you have such a passion for science fiction and why you created Future Dude. And like the new series that you're working on and the new feature that you have, Persephone, I am blown away by the things that you were telling me earlier right before this interview about that, because the importance of bringing actual, tangible, real science to science fiction. Like the fantasy part is awesome. That's great.
Yeah. I'm cool with that too. But
but you were bringing up some really valid points. I definitely want to talk a bit about that, about why real, actual science, scientific knowledge is important in science fiction.
Well, here's something funny. Okay, so like right now, I'm developing this. I just got through pitching this 13-part science fiction adventure series to National Geographic for the Disney Plus channel. We'll see how it goes. I think we've got a good shot. But this series is it's about a group of teenagers who are kind of like cadets in sort of a Starfleet type situation, like Star Trek, but except it's set in our solar system. The entire series is in the solar system, and it's all based. It's about 100 years from now, that kind of thing. And this adventure, I've designed some really cool spaceships, and I've got this great team of people I'm putting together for it. And my visual effects guys, I have them doing shots of the spacecraft. And one of the things I'm struggling with is they have the spaceships fly like airplanes. That's what these guys keep doing. They keep doing shots where the ships are banking around and flying. I'm like, guys, real spaceships don't fly like that. So I actually took them through a class yesterday where I made them watch all this footage of the LIM docking with the Apollo command module, for example, or the space shuttle maneuvering and docking with the space station. And I was like, this is what you guys have to do. We have to make the ships move. They're moving at right angles. They have the thrusters. They're firing. And actually, it's really cool. It actually looks cooler than having. It's not X-wings. It's like there's a reality to it. And so part of what I want to do is I want to get the audience excited about seeing the real stuff and how the real stuff works, because I think there's something magical about seeing spacecraft move at these angles and seeing the thrusters fire and all that stuff. That's like really cool, right? And by the same token, it's like, yeah, do I think warp drive in Star Trek is cool? Sure. It's just, but you're passing stars like streetlights, and you get between star systems in a matter of hours or days, and it's just not real life, And so I think that while I love those kind of science fantasy stories, they've done a bit of let's say this. I don't want to accuse them of doing the disservice. I think the problem is that there's not enough stuff to balance it. It's almost like could you imagine if you made a movie about a doctor and you as the writer based your movie on being a doctor on watching TV shows about doctors instead of talking to real doctors, right?
Yeah.
Right. So it's almost like playing a game of telephone. It's like by the time you get there, there's no real medicine in it. Does that make sense? Because all your medical knowledge is based upon watching a fictional story about medicine. Does that make, what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly.
Yeah, and that's what I think has happened to a lot of sci-fi. It's like people are building stories off of what they think science is and what they think technology, how it works. And they're getting it really wrong and making a lot of stuff up. And then the public watches it and that becomes reality to them.
Yep.
Yeah,
I completely agree with you. And that ties in with what you said earlier about how you almost feel like people aren't able to really absorb information when it comes to things like, climate change, for instance, when you mentioned that.
Right.
With this, when you actually are surrounded by that language and that tongue, and that helps evolve the human consciousness and the human knowledge, really, of like what science really is actually like. So, oh my gosh, well, that's really, really cool. I want to talk about, and this is going to get a lot of people excited. We were talking about how one of the star systems in your feature is it's going to be in Proxima B, so the exoplanet. So, and you brought up such a valid point earlier. You're like, rather than just visiting, like these imaginary systems, which is cool and all, like you said, but there's actual exoplanets.
Right. Literally, the nearest star to Earth, there's a planet. And it's orbiting in what would be its Goldilocks zone, right? And when I read about that in 2016, 2017, I was like, I want to do a movie about this. I want to go there. I want to see this, And so I actually sat down with science advisors and we started trying to plot out, and I actually got to kind of design a planet. It's like, what would this planet be like? And so you find out it's tidally locked, meaning that one side faces the star all the time, the other side faces away, kind of like our moon, right? Mm-hmm. And so then I was like, okay, so if the planet has an atmosphere, what would that cause? And we were able to create these really cool things. Like there's this perpetual storm between the line between day and night on this planet because of constantly, right? That's something that could really happen, right? Mm-hmm. And so it ends up being in our story a really cool visual element. It actually ends up becoming a problem for our characters. But I'm just throwing this out as this is the kind of real stuff we're doing, right?
Yeah.
Trying to figure out like, okay, that star is like really there's a lot of solar flares, and it's it's a very dangerous place to be. And so you were on this planet, this high radiation. So that plays into my story. The idea of why is the atmosphere not blown off the planet by the radiation? That's in my story. All these things, right? So what I do is I really try to create a basis of reality as I go with all this stuff that was founded on the science and also projecting what we think could be there. So it's what I call the 85% rule, where we're trying to get the science like 85% accurate, and then 15% you kind of tweak it to make a cool movie, and everything. And I think that's a pretty good percentage when you get something like Star Wars that's like at probably zero, it's right. It's just not. There's just no science in there, and it's you get it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a percentile that I feel like more films in Hollywood should actually be following.
Yeah.
It's educational to the public, but entertaining at the same time.
Exactly. And it's interesting too, because I was just at this space conference and
ISDC.
And the thing is, I was talking to a lot of the people there, and people would come up to me and they would talk to me about the technical accuracy of this and that. And I'm like, I get it, and I'm the choir, I'm with you, but there's the audience that's going to really get it. The actual technical accuracy is going to be in the thousands, and we want to make a film that will reach millions of people, right? So what I tell them is, I'm going to respect where you're coming from because I agree with you, but I also have to find a way to translate it for a broad audience, and that's what we're doing. That's the thing that I feel like Hollywood's missing. It's like, I think, like I've been pitching in Hollywood movies like The Martian for 20 years. And when as a matter of fact, Ridley Scott had actually optioned one of my stories about Mars back in the 90s. And he ultimately ended up doing The Martian. But it was interesting when I would pitch around Hollywood, the question was always, well, where are the monsters? Where are the aliens? Are there going to be space battles in this? I'm like, you don't need that. Space is already trying to kill you.
Yeah.
It's already dangerous enough. And what's nice now is that it feels like Hollywood's starting to get that you can tell realistic stories and that there's still an adventurous spirit to them, that you can reach a broad audience with a big action adventure without it being a bunch of made up stuff and needing to be chased by aliens or something like that. So,
yeah, exactly.
So anyway, I know I'm all over the place here, but hopefully
no, it's so awesome. And it's also relevant, and you're doing so many incredible things. And I still have a million questions I want to ask you just about the film itself. But one thing is, we were looking over at some of the visuals of what I believe it was for Saturn V, of the characters and their spacesuits. Is there specific companies that exist today that inspired you for the spacesuits, or were those all fictional?
It's interesting. So having been a space aficionado since childhood, I've looked at, I watched the evolution of the NASA suits going all the way back to Mercury. Mm-hmm. And that's been interesting when they had the kind of silver suits. And if you look at a lot of the sci-fi at the time, like Lost in Space and all those things, you could definitely tell that they were trying to kind of emulate that.
Yeah.
Right? And then you progress and you go through the Apollo suits and the space shuttle suits. And, what I did is I've worked with a company called Orbital Outfitters. They're in Los Angeles, and they actually are connected to a company called Global Effects that does a lot of, they provide props and materials for films. And so they build spacesuits, and they would build spacesuits for film and TV. So they did spacesuits in From the Earth to the Moon. They did Firefly, the suits in that and everything. As a matter of fact, you go to their warehouse in LA, you can see all the suits from all these movies and actually touch them. It's pretty cool. Armageddon, things like that. Anyway, I talked to those guys because they started building real spacesuits. They built the spacesuits for SpaceX, for example, and I believe they even were working with Virgin Galactic as well. But regardless, they showed me years ago what they were designing for SpaceX, the spacesuits. And so I was looking at that and I was going, okay, so with these new materials and the new ways of approaching this, there's also, what was it? What's it called? I think it's called a nanosuit. There's I think it's from MIT a few years ago. I researched and I saw this new kind of skin suit that's a spacesuit, but it's very, very thin and very flexible, made out of new materials. And that was another influence. So those are all things that I do. Is I talk to people like Global Effects. I do research and I look at materials and all the, and then I also want it to look cool, so that's another thing. It's like I look at the history of sort of sci-fi costumes. Mm-hmm. And I think there've been places where they're like high points where it's like, wow, that's awesome. That's a really cool, outfit. And so I try to mix my NASA research with my, industry guys with the cool stuff and put it all together into something. So that's how we get there. Yeah.
It's such an inspiration that you do so much research before even like
Oh yeah.
creating your films and everything that you've done. And I think, you know, we know that some movies have done that and a lot of them actually haven't. So I hope that this really inspires like a whole generation of like future producers, directors, and writers to follow in exactly in your footsteps when it comes to science fiction writing and creating new things. That do you feel like it still would be considered like science fiction, because it is fictional, but it's actually like a higher percentage of science than fiction now?
Yeah,
Is there
you know, it's funny.
genre?
I've heard people call it science faction. I
Science
kind of makes me,
faction.
yeah. And so it's kind of funny. It's
Kinda
like,
cringe
we're
worthy.
doing science faction. I'm like, oh, okay. You know, so it's, you know, but yeah, it's, you know what I would say? Let's look at it a different way. The actual term science fiction is what I'm trying to do. Like when people call Star Trek science fiction, it actually isn't. It's science inspired fantasy, if you really think about it, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a, you know, yes, there might be some technical basis for some of the things that they're doing in the story, but artificial gravity, you know, you don't know how it works in that show. It's just, one of the guys I was with this past week, and he calls it push button gravity. You know, the animation, one of the animations I just sent you, is you'll see the middle of the spacecraft rotating and spinning, you know, for that sort of centrifugal force situation to create, you know, artificial gravity in the ship. And then when the ship is actually cruising through the solar system, you know, when they're firing the engine, I have them firing their engine so they accelerate at 1G. So what happens is that the front of the ship ends up being kind of the ceiling. And so our crew is able to walk around and you know, experience, because the ship's constantly accelerating, you know, or decelerating at 1G. So that's a big part of it. But then when they're not, they spin the midsection for artificial gravity. So the ship, the Sagan, that's how I designed it to function like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wait, you called it the Sagan?
It's called the Sagan. Yeah.
Like Carl Sagan.
Like Dr. Carl Sagan. Yes.
Like Dr. Carl Sagan. Oh,
Yes.
that's awesome.
That's the ship, and that's my enterprise. It's the Sagan. Yeah. So yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I think we were talking a little bit earlier that some of your inspiration came from Cosmos and like Carl Sagan and some of his work earlier on. What is some other inspiration that really motivated you to not only go into like writing, but also into creating your company, Future?
You know, so I guess key touch points for me would be Gene Roddenberry, you know, because of what he did with Star Trek. It's a cultural phenomenon, and Star Trek in the 1960s, when combined with the Apollo program, what NASA was doing at the time, that became a huge motivator for so many people, and the integrity of his vision and the humanism and his interest in really talking about the human condition. You know, he actually wanted to make a show about the 1960s. He wanted to make a show set in the 1960s about the 1960s and really talking about the social upheaval and everything. And the network execs were like, man, we see that on the news every night. It's depressing. People watch TV to escape. So he went back to the drawing board and thought about it. And he said, you know, I want to, okay, I'll make a show about the 60s, but I'll set it in the 23rd century. Right. And so if you look at the conflicts and the situations and the things that are in Star Trek, it's a mirror for the 1960s in a lot of ways. And so what I'm trying to do is create science fiction now in, you know, 2019, 2020, that's a mirror of what's going on nowadays. But having stories that are set, you know, 80 years from now, 150 years from now, that sort of thing. And then using that as a mirror back, you know. So that's why I would say Gene Roddenberry is a big influence for me. Carl Sagan, obviously, because of his interest in popularizing science. That was enormous for me. When I saw Cosmos when I was about, I guess, 13 years old, and I watched that series every single episode. I was just voracious for it, and I, you know, read the book, and that kind of became my Bible. You know, Cosmos is an amazing achievement, I think. So Carl Sagan, just, you know, following his work over the years, and just seeing what he did, creating the movie, the book Contact, and then the subsequent film. You know, I just think Sagan there are scientists that I know that are very much about, it feels like their energy is kind of like, well, if you want this knowledge, come up here and join me in the ivory tower and come get it, you know? And Sagan was kind of like, no, that's the wrong way to do this. Let's let's bring the science to the people. Let's help the people understand, and then they'll join us. Well, and that is what we need. We have to have that, or things are not going to ever improve. So Sagan's been another influence for me. I would say that George Lucas was an influence for me as not necessarily as a storyteller or filmmaker, but as a business person. Seeing the maneuvers that the way he created his business, creating Lucasfilm and really creating this multi-billion-dollar empire based on his IP, it's fascinating and spectacular what he's accomplished. So I think that really Future Dude's kind of a culmination of those three things. The storyteller in Gene Roddenberry, the science popularizing of Carl Sagan, and then the sort of the business acumen and approach of George Lucas, and doing a science. I'm not going to call it science fiction, but a space fantasy. That's my term for Star Wars. Space fantasy. Yes. It's a space fantasy. That's what it is. So the space fantasy of Star Wars, and using that as an IP that then launched this cultural phenomenon. So that's very much what I'm trying to do.
Wow. Yeah. That is so fascinating. Like, now this whole journey that you've gone through, it's now leading up to, obviously, like the point that you're at right now. Are there like any partnerships that either you've had, or like some dream partnerships you'd love to eventually achieve one day that you can just think of, whether it's like a person you'd want to work with, or a corporation, or go somewhere?
Well, I did education in public. So my background kind of coming into this, so I've kind of dual tracked. When I was younger, I dual tracked my interest in science. I was always kind of studying science and tech all along the way, but I was a filmmaker, and I directed music videos and commercials, and did documentary stuff like that. And so, and I'm also a visual artist. So my early company, we did some comic books and things like that. So I was able to kind of package all this together, and I launched this nonprofit. It was called Project Universe, that I ran from 99 until 2006 or so. Mm-hmm. And that nonprofit became a subcontractor of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And it was really cool. Yeah, I worked with that. And then my for-profit that I launched after that, Buzz Aldrin, was one of our major clients, and it was really cool. So I get the time I spent at JPL, we worked on the Outer Planets program. We worked on one of the Pluto missions. It was just so cool for me. It was like, like I had done music video stuff with Prince back in the 90s, since the choreography, and so it's funny because
down right now. This is the coolest thing ever.
It's a different world, it's like
in one sentence.
Well, it's kind of funny because it's like I've had these different lives in the same life. It's like no one would, having met me back then, would have known how much I was into space and science, because I was just this guy who was doing music videos and hanging around with all these musicians, and I looked I had long hair back then, and very different time. So
I want to see photos.
So I was a very Prince kind of guy, actually. But I was still always the science person. And so the point is, when I went to NASA, they were like, well, it's really cool. You did this stuff with like Prince and videos and Chuck Yeager and things like that. And then they were like, and I was like, but you guys are really cool because you sent probes to Jupiter and you did, so it was like, so it ended up being this really, really cool kind of symbiosis. It was like, they were like, you can help us tell our story. That's what we want, because you get it. You understand the tech of it, the technical aspects of it. But, we don't quite know how to make this as cool as it needs to be to get kids fired up. We don't have, as you were talking about earlier, we don't have people walking on the moon. And it was very sad to me, because a lot of the work I did in education, the space shuttle, while it was a really cool vehicle, kids weren't fired up about it. At least the kids that I would interact with, if you talk to them about it, they go, okay, that sounds pretty neat. But they weren't like, it was like, well, where does it go? Well, it goes up to the space station. Well, what do they do there? Well, they do scientific research. It's like, oh, okay. You kind of feel this slump with them. They kind of was like, oh, Whereas if you said, we're going to the moon, or we're going to Mars, kids got more fired up about it. So, so anyway, I guess I want to go back to what your question was. So collaborations I've had in the past, the JPL, Buzz Aldrin, things like that, that was awesome. I worked with Lockheed Martin a little bit. That was really cool. But I say going forward for me, I want to meet like Richard Branson. Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, guys like that, like, because they're trying to actually bring us out there, and they're doing it in a commercial way, which I actually think is, I think there's got to be a balance, because I'm extremely excited about NASA. Always have been, always will be. NASA's my thing. But I also think that this civilian stuff is very exciting, and they have the money to kind of throw at it and take the risks, and these publicly funded organizations, it's different. They can't kind of take the same risks that someone like a Richard Branson can take, and
Yeah.
I relate to his entrepreneurial spirit, if that makes sense, so it's like, so that's a guy I want to meet, so if you're watching Richard Branson, you're a guy, lunch sometime, come on, let's do it.
Yeah, let's do
Yeah,
it.
let's do it, so yeah, he's the kind of guy that I'd like to meet. I'm hoping that this National Geographic thing pans out, because I think they'd be an incredible partner.
Yeah.
We're looking at targeting these shows for Disney Plus, which would be really neat. Disney's got 5 key platforms that they're doing with Disney Plus. They're doing Disney Channel, Pixar, Marvel, Star Wars, and then National Geographic, right?
Wow.
And National Geographic starting to do these dramas. Like, did you see the Mars show they did?
Yes.
Yeah. So that was like a hybrid. And then now they're going all the way to dramas. So they just did the Hot Zone, which was, as I haven't seen it yet, but I hear it's pretty good.
I haven't seen it either. The Hot Zone, huh?
Yeah. And then I'm what we're targeting for Saturn V, and then I have one other project with them called Neptune 1, which is a underwater adventure. And the idea with those shows is that they'd be targeted to the same audience as Lost in Space, the Netflix Lost in Space.
Yes.
So it's like a family show, which is something I've always wanted to do. I think that a lot of these sci-fi shows in the last 20 years, the good ones, they're very adult, and they're very dark, and they're very serious. And, like I love the show The Expanse, but it's not a kid's show.
Yeah.
It's not for kids. Firefly, another show I really like a lot, not a kid's show. I like the days of like Star Trek: The Next Generation, where a family could sit and watch a show, but it wasn't dumb and it didn't talk down to you. It was actually incredibly intelligent. And I talk to people right now they grew up as kids watching Star Trek: The Next Generation, and it really inspired them. And we're missing that right now. So that's what I'm trying to do. I want to bring the same energy that Next Generation had to a family audience, and be able to bring and teach science, but have these really cool characters and great adventures at the forefront, and the science is kind of the backdrop for it. So.
Yeah, wow. Well, Jeffrey, that is all so incredible. Like, all of this information. And where do you think, where are people going to be able to find any of this information on you? Website?
Well, a good starting point is my website, which is futuredude.com. And there's stuff on there about all my different projects, the features I'm working on, TV projects. The newer ones aren't on there yet, but there's still plenty you can see, animation, different things we've done. So Future Dude would be the best place to learn about me and my work.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so amazing. Did you know when anything's going to be coming out for the public to see? Anything that we can keep an eye out for? Any dates? Yeah.
So let's see. Persephone will be. We're going into production in February of 2020.
Okay.
But we're already way ahead on all of it. So we're doing visual effects. We're getting it all done. Our post-production cycle should be pretty quick. So we're expecting that film to be out either fourth quarter of 2020 or the first quarter of 2021. So that'll be that. And then these Nat Geo TV series, we're still kind of getting all that put together, but I'm assuming we're talking probably 2021 on that stuff. So is when it'll start to hit. So.
Such a good year too. Mars 2020 rover, 2020 is when the ISS is opening their doors for space tourism.
2020 is kind of that's our real blow up year.
It is. Yeah. No, that's awesome. Well, is there anything else that you actually want to talk about that we didn't get to cover? This has been an epic interview. You were filled with so much inspiration and knowledge, and I had no idea about all these past partnerships you had.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, it's, I'm just like always honored to have the opportunity to talk about my work and to connect with people like yourself who are, bringing the word out to the public, and your space peeps. Space peeps are awesome. I've got space peeps myself. So, I think it's really cool. And people like us have to work together, stick together, and keep getting the word out there and fighting the fight. There's a challenge ahead of us, and I'm never trying to be negative, because I really believe our species can overcome these things, but we're not going to overcome it unless we take on the challenge and we're aggressive about it, and we work together and collaborate and find new ways. Because honestly, our educational system, just to be blunt, has really failed us, I think. And it just has really, really failed us. We've got so many people who don't care about these things or think about them. And it's people like us that have to turn the tide and get it going in a different direction. Yeah. So
Yeah, I
yeah.
couldn't have said it any better. You're 100% right about that. And I think that's one big thing that is a major takeaway from this is just the space outreach and scientific outreach to larger communities and people around the world, because it's all about moving humanity forward into our
Uh,
next steps of,
yes.
evolution.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, if you think about it, the best humans have been is when we're challenged. We challenge ourselves with
Yes.
exploration, and we challenge ourselves with not being too comfortable. When you're just comfortable, you kind of hang out and you just sort of stagnate, you know. And I think
Mhm.
I see, you know, we need challenges to find our best, you know. And the more we challenge ourselves, the better we become. And we need to evolve. You're absolutely right. We've got to get that next step to move forward, you know. And I think this challenge of climate change, um we don't have a lot of time.
Mhm.
We have to do this now. And if we don't, you know, it could be a different outcome than what we want, you know. And
Yeah.
I think it's the difference between creating Star Trek on one hand or Mad Max, you know. You know,
Yes.
and it's like, and it's amazing to be alive at the time where it's like, well, is it going to be Star Trek or is it going to be Mad Max? And it's like we're literally right here, right now, on the precipice of which one will it be, you know. So
Yeah.
yeah, not to be negative. I'm not trying to be negative, but it's just I got to inject that reality into these things because there's an urgency to it, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't see it as negative at all. It's more about just shining light on what the issues are and saying like, okay, it's the time is now and we need to get motivated and
Yeah,
move together as a community because that's what we are as humans. We're
right.
one huge human species. We're all a
Exactly.
community and we
Exactly.
need to move together. So
Absolutely.
well, wow. I mean, on that note, thank you so
Yeah,
much. This has been
absolutely.
such an epic interview. To all my space peeps out there, definitely check him out. This is Jeffrey Morris at futuredude.com. So check out everything that he's doing. Check out his features is coming out, the awesome 13-part series that, again, fingers crossed for Nat Geo. That is super exciting. Or Disney Channel. It'd be really awesome.
Yeah.
And yeah, once again, thank you so much, Jeffrey, for coming
Sure.
on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.